Hot off the presses.
Hot off the presses. It's something I've wanted to watch for a while because they've been building it up. There's been like promotion and trailers and all this stuff about it. And today / tonight / whenever you're listening to this, we are going to talk about Quiet on Set, the dark side of kids TV.
Kids TV.
This is a new documentary that came out on HBO Max and is also premiering on Discovery Television.
Oh, really?
They had like a simultaneous premiere.
Oh, I didn't know
But
that.
it was on TV, the first 2 episodes, and then I think the other 2 episodes might be out by this point.
On Discovery.
On Discovery. But it's fully out on HBO Max.
Yeah.
So it was actually interesting just from a television / streaming perspective.
Yeah,
because
that's a weird way to do it.
Yeah, like they released it and then people have to wait another like week or so to catch it.
Yeah.
But technically, if you have cable, is it free? I don't know what the
No, either. That's strange.
why they did it like that.
I'm
But
stuck. Carry on.
be free, brother.
All right. I got it. I figured it out.
So this is a documentary focusing initially on Dan Schneider, which was a well-known producer / writer / director of way more of Nickelodeon shows than I thought.
Me too. The massive cash cow for Nickelodeon.
Yeah, he did all that. He did Kenan and Kel. He did Drake and Josh, Zoe 101, iCarly, Victorious. I mean,
The Amanda Show.
The Amanda Show, yeah. And he just he was a writer for a while, and then eventually became like producer and director, and like he had his hands in everything.
Yep.
And it's kind of crazy because he really influenced modern culture as far as comedy, and a ton of people nowadays, my generation, but yours too, of like how our comedy is, and just a cultural touchstone.
Yeah, all that was massive for me.
Yeah.
And I only knew him as like, I'm pretty sure he did cameos in all that and in Good Burger and stuff like that. And that's literally, I was like, oh, that guy?
Yeah.
Like that's the only thing I've ever seen him as.
Specifically in the documentary, there's one point where he's dressed up as like Einstein or the old guy.
Yeah.
And the Amanda Show
Yes.
skit. And I didn't even know that was him until they showed it in the documentary. I was like, whoa.
It's crazy how instrumental someone can be in that many things.
Yes.
And I never knew who was behind them all. Why, that was the hardest I've ever had. Hardest time I've ever had saying something in my entire life.
And
That was out of control.
Yes.
Yeah, like I never had a name and a face to put with like someone that was responsible for all
He's
this.
like the Christopher Nolan of Nickelodeon
It's
shows.
crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Even working on Amanda Bynes' show after.
Yes.
The Amanda Show with, I think, one of the co-writers of Friends.
Yes.
So like moving into different worlds.
I
and
forgot
stuff
what the
like
name
that.
of the show, but
I forget too. You got to watch the
What I Like
documentary.
About You.
It sounds kind of familiar.
That might be a
actually.
movie.
It might be a movie. So yeah, that he's largely the focus in the first episode.
Yep.
And it ends up covering some of the darkest stories I've ever heard in the, being on the sets, not all about Dan Schneider, but about the sets and the atmosphere on his shows and involving some of his crew members, which we can go into some detail with. For anyone who's new to the show, we don't really do spoilers, but with something like a documentary, we're probably going to talk about some key points.
Yeah.
It is, let's talk about it just as a show first.
Yes.
I thought the documentary was like, it's one of the best documentaries I feel like I've maybe ever seen.
Okay.
I was so intrigued, and
Yes.
I sat down to watch. I was like, I'm going to watch 1, maybe 2 episodes.
Yep. That's how I went in.
I watched all 4.
All 4.
Yeah.
It is captivating.
I could not stop watching it.
Yes, because the way the content is given to you, it's very well made in that regard.
Yeah.
There were some points where I felt like they were like leading you on a thread, and it ultimately didn't lead to anywhere.
Yeah.
Like they had certain people to interview and talk about, and they just talked about like a bad experience, and then there wasn't much evidence pointing one way or the other. If
I
they
do
were,
agree
like,
with that.
accurate with that.
I have a comment on that actually. Yeah.
Yeah, there were just some people that like, for instance, I think Mark Summers was in it. He was only in one scene in the first episode.
Yes.
And it feels so like, why have him?
Feels like a tease.
Yeah, a tease that he had like some story to tell.
What's so funny is, at the beginning of a documentary, there's often like a setup and a bunch of shots of, in this one in particular, they're setting you up to, what am I going to see in this documentary? So it shows a lot of old shows and Many of you probably remember Mark Summers, who was the host of Double Dare. What Would You Do? I think before that, he did a ton.
I think he ended up going to Unwrapped after, right?
Oh, did he? Oh, that's right. That's right. And when the show started, they started showing clips of that, and I paused it and I said to Rachel, I was like, I swear to you, if this show puts a dark spin on Mark Summers, I will turn it off and I will not watch the rest of the show. And like 2 seconds later, it was him like being interviewed as like obviously not one of the people accused of any wrongdoing. And I was like, all right, we can keep watching it.
We're good.
I was like, bro, if I found out he or Summer Sanders were in on some madness, I'm gonna be so mad.
Be so upsetting.
But yeah, that was a huge tease to see him at the beginning. And you really, I think you see him. Do you ever see him again? Actually,
I think there's
in the last episode, does he say like one thing?
Yeah, he might just say one thing.
Yeah,
like just some quick just whatever. I don't even know if it was
that. That is a crazy one in particular to have Mark Summers, who is, if you're talking about that like golden age of Nickelodeon, and you have him there. I mean, what did they sit him down to have him say one thing?
Yeah, right. Like you got to think they probably had a bunch of questions for him, and he either didn't have great answers, or they just the way the documentary is being filmed, the focus might have changed.
Yeah,
and so maybe he just wasn't worth having more than just the one moment. But
yeah, maybe they were like, we got to at least get him in here or something. But very weird one.
Time, you know?
Very weird one to like show and not go further with.
But that being said, the documentaries, other than that, I found it really, I don't want to say enjoyable. I found it fascinating.
Fascinating, yeah. And that's what I mean by like as a show, like as a documentary first, because I feel like you kind of have to talk about it in two different ways.
Yes.
Because the content is so heavy. So as a work, it is so good.
Yes.
Like to me, it felt like, and this is a huge positive because I love shows like this, but like an Unsolved Mysteries, you know, that to me is almost like the foundation of a really good documentary.
Yeah.
Like, I want a good story told. I want some sort of resolution, you know, and to your point, like there were a couple threads that I was like, oh man, I
would want more from it.
Yeah.
Like context or whatever.
Exactly. Now, trying to think of what points I want to touch on because it left me with some interesting thoughts in the first episode. I mean, I think we can probably get out of the way that it's absolutely a keeper.
Yes.
And
you know, just in case we talk spoilers after this point, because again, I feel like it's important to talk about it because the content of the story is just crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a keeper. It's very much a true crime story. It's rated TV-14, but it feels TVMA.
Yeah, we started watching it with the kids in the room. They weren't watching it with us, but immediately, I mean, it's explicit in like, you're not seeing anything, but some of the things they're talking about, it deals heavily with child abuse, sexual abuse, sexual harassment. So be warned about that. There are warnings as bumpers on each episode.
Yep.
So, but just be aware of that. That's pretty heavy. Rachel cried. I came close. It's a hard watch in that respect.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you're right. I would not watch it around kids or
it hurts because it like hits close to home.
Yes,
because that's something that, you know, there's a story specifically about a girl who really loved watching the Amanda Show, and she was able to go on the show, and what happened after, and you're like, geez, like that could have been anybody. Could have been anybody.
Yes.
And
that one was brutal.
Yeah, it's just like there are just stories that are told that we all wished we could do that as a kid, and then when kids actually did it.
It wasn't always a good outcome.
It wasn't the best outcome. So,
but one interesting thing to note is there are a lot of names from those shows, big names that we did not see in the documentary.
Yes,
and you know, I don't mean this in any like, you know, stirring up controversy way, but it makes you wonder like, why weren't they on the show?
Yep.
The majority of the show focuses. It does overall focus on Dan Schneider and the environments he fostered. But the darkest parts of the stories are about two of his crew members, one in particular.
Yes.
Who, it is my understanding, he didn't hire or anything like that, but they did work for him for a long time. And the biggest draw of the show is an extensive interview with Drake Bell.
Yes.
Who was on the Amanda Show and Drake and Josh,
Mm-hmm.
and we have not heard his story publicly in any capacity.
Nope.
He kind of like, he was off the map for a while.
Yeah, he kind of like he had a DUI at one point.
Yep.
He ran away to Mexico, as a lot of us heard, and
He got in trouble for texting with a minor.
Yeah.
And there were some other allegations, which I wanted to talk about those in a few minutes too.
Mm-hmm.
But just a lot of like off the rails child star stuff.
Yeah, and that's the thing. A lot of people were just like, that's another child star who's just completely lost it.
Right.
And having him tell the story he did, it kind of shines a light on all the other child stars out there who
Yes.
are. It's eye opening. It's very eye opening.
It really is. So I don't know if you've seen this yet, but what's interesting is, very soon after the documentary came out, Dan Schneider posted a 20-minute interview.
I watched like the first minute of it.
Okay.
I haven't watched all of it yet, but
So that exists. I would say it's worth watching just for consideration.
yep.
Couple things about this documentary. So a lot of the allegations are around the idea that a lot of the jokes in physicality on the shows were actually very much innuendo and very, very inappropriate for kids. There are other things that are in regards to the workplace. So there are these two writers that you hear from throughout the majority of the show. And I didn't love what they experienced, but I really loved hearing their stories.
Yeah.
And I guess what's a good way to say it? I was grateful that they chose to share their
Right.
stories and their
'Cause
experiences.
It sounded like there was a lot of writers that could have said something, and they were the only two who said anything.
Yeah, and it's hard to share that kind of stuff, and it's which I find really interesting too. When you hear someone sharing trauma or a traumatic experience at all, you're like, of course, you're free to share this. Why would I blame you for this, or
Right.
why would I not have some layer of understanding or forgiveness for you? And depending on the situation, in some cases, it's like, why would I put any blame on you at all for this?
Right.
You know what I mean? But then when you do have something traumatic happen to you, it is a very real thing that stuff comes into your brain where you're like, I can't just go out and share this.
Well, plus the other people involved. I mean, like, you do not know the amount of power that the people
the power dynamic is crazy.
Yeah, and the people you're speaking out against might very well cause some your inability to work.
Right.
Even.
Like, these are new writers.
Yep.
They're doing what they've always wanted to do. And and then this is compounded with the kids who are getting their dream very early in life. And what sucks is, like, even as the writers who were young adults when they were going through this tumultuous workplace environment, I feel like as you grow as a person later down the road, you're like, that job was not like my entire life.
Right.
And it's like, you almost wish, this is not their words, but I've just thought about things like this. Like, I wish back then I realized that job was not my entire life and I spoke up more or whatever. You know what I mean?
It feels like it when you're in it.
Of course.
Because you never want to just like lose your job unless
No.
you hate it or whatever. But
Yeah. They said they liked it,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
You know, the
That
job
was-
itself, they loved. Did I cut you off? Or were you
no,
gonna say?
that was pretty much it.
Okay. I mean, I did cut you off, but
Yeah, but there wasn't much else to say. Just jobs can don't worry about them.
don't worry about it.
Don't worry. Speak up if bad things are happening.
So, yes, 100%. I want to be careful with this because everybody who shared, so we hear from child stars, some of them I recognize. I was like, oh my gosh, like Katrina from All That.
Yep.
I was like, I always wondered what happened to her.
Yeah, because
She
there were people. I honestly didn't even know there was a second cast of All That.
Isn't that nuts?
I didn't remember except the one kid with the glasses. He always stood out of my
Yeah,
my
I
mind.
remembered him too. Yeah, that's so funny. I was so fascinated with them talking about like kids coming in to replace other kids and stuff because I have memories of being like, oh, I wonder what happened to that other cast member.
Yeah.
And then you just move on. You don't
Yeah.
think about it anymore.
It's just like, oh, I guess that's it. They're not on the show.
Yeah, and the idea of like when Amanda came in, she was such a big deal, and I remember loving her so much, and she was so good. And even in watching the clips of her as a kid in the
Yeah.
show, you're like, wow, she really
She really was like
so talented.
She was very talented and still is. We hope.
Yeah, I guess she started resurfacing a little bit like on TikTok and stuff like
Yeah.
that, and I'm hearing she seems like she's trying to get better, and I know she's had the child star like rocky road of transition to adult.
Yeah.
Is like a very real thing.
And it's kind of crazy because I remember her being in movies, and
she did, I think, three pretty good sized movies.
Yeah, and she just disappeared. And I don't understand why, because it's like, is it Hollywood? Are they getting like just crazy and not making good decisions? Like, I don't know how that happens.
I mean, to me, it ends up having a lot to do with power. And the tough thing when you have kids in that kind of situation, kids working that young, is ultimately like an adult to some degree has to be responsible for the decisions they're making.
Yeah.
To some degree. And obviously, ages vary and things like that. But even when you're in your teens, even your late teens, you think you know more than you do.
Right.
And sometimes your decisions work out great for you. Sometimes they don't. Like that varies. I'm not saying, at that age you don't know anything, but I know I look back at that time and I'm like, oh, there's a myriad of things that I would have approached differently. And you're working at a level that is just way too much. Like it's just way too much. So you can't necessarily make sound decisions. So you're just kind of hoping that the adult you choose to trust is the right one.
Right. Is the one who will actually guide you into the right
decisions.
decisions.
Like they actually have your best interest in mind, which is, of course, the devastation of the story of Drake. Bell, not the rapper.
Right.
With all the allegations around the, what was that? Oh, my preface to this was going to be, I think everyone's story, like we heard from so many different people, and of course, nothing I'm about to say is meant to like invalidate people's like experiences or anything like that. But I did find it interesting, and I wonder if you felt this at all, because you mentioned like some lines of the documentary not necessarily having evidence one way or the other.
Yeah.
So in the very first episode, they're really leaning into, there's this scene with this young girl, and the payoff of the joke is essentially pornographic. And they showed the scene, and I was like, I know cumulatively we're supposed to assume that Dan Schneider wrote these sketches to be like grotesque, and like we're supposed to look at him as like the antagonist. And I'm also not saying this to like excuse anything, but I'm just saying in the first episode, most of the scenes they showed, I was like, I don't know, that just looks like a kid's joke to me.
That's the thing. I think a lot of these, and again, it's everything you said. It's perspective, and I think a lot of these jokes will look bad if you think they look bad.
Right.
And otherwise, they're very innocent. I would think.
Now, I will say the majority.
Yeah, there are some. There's some like...
the Ariana Grande one.
For sure. There's no...
That's a nightmare. I had a hard time even watching that.
Yeah.
There is a collection of Ariana Grande clips, and I actually saw this floating around the internet independently, like on TikTok or something like that. And I don't think those clips aired, but I could... Yeah. I think be wrong.
They were there was like a web page, and you would get exclusive behind the scene clips of those characters.
So those weren't in an episode.
Right. That was like in her bedroom, and she was a character for I don't think it might have been for Sam and Cat, which Sam and Cat was like 2012 or something. Like that show was more recent.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the All That stuff, the Zoe 101 stuff, like those felt, at least to me, innocent. And like not as intense as they make it seem.
No, and I mean, there was one compilation of the scenes like later on in the show, and just like a quick cut. You're not watching it for like minutes and minutes. It's probably 10 seconds of different scenes while someone is talking about like the ill-intended nature of these jokes.
Yeah.
And when you see them all next to each other, it is a little like...
Especially framed in the way where it's like, now imagine these being related to like porn or whatever.
Yeah, it was like, okay, yeah, like this looks bad, and some of them were like awkward positions, and the key issue being that it involves kids. Like we're talking about teenagers or younger, so like yes, that's weird for sure. But I did feel like in the first episode, I'm like, I'm not there with you yet. That these are like intentionally dirty scenes.
Yep.
So I thought that was kind of interesting, and then again, I don't know if I just said this a minute ago or if I thought it really hard, but we're talking about the cumulative behaviors of Dan Schneider and like the environments on the show.
Right.
So I know like the story that those writers told, there's one in particular that is like, it was hard to even listen to.
Yeah.
Just the humiliation of what she experienced. And that was another one where I'm like, she's telling that story and I'm like, I know she feels like shame. Actually, she didn't even really tell the story.
No,
she
was
didn't
like,
want to talk
I'll
about
skip
it. But I'm like, why would she like, I'm hearing it and I'm just like, you were definitely like the victim in that moment. They're like power dynamic that's thrown around and whatever. So hearing that and hearing other stories about the work environment and seeing some of the scenes, I definitely am like, okay, I see what people are seeing.
Yeah.
But I just didn't think it was all of them, you know? And again, this is just an observation.
Yeah. I think you're right, though. Like, seeing it out all across the years as he did more and more scenes like that, collectively, it definitely is not great.
Not great. Yeah. Yeah. And like, I would just say that the work environment stuff felt to me to be the worst offense.
Yeah.
This is the thing I think I don't want to say, but I guess I'm just curious, like what you think or what anyone listening or watching thinks. It was not an excuse. I'm not saying it excuses it, but it was a different time. And I do wonder, because they were talking about, you know, it was a largely male crew and mostly male writers, and they were like joking around in the writer's room about some of these things. And Dan Schneider himself said like sometimes it would definitely get too far. And so again, I'm not excusing it. There should have been a better awareness. I kind of hate that things like workplace harassment and everything is only something we've been really hammering down on in the past few years. That seems crazy.
Right. Yeah.
But I just wonder if it didn't seem as crazy then, and if like to the writers and to
I think. Did you want to finish that?
No, I guess that's it. I'm probably talking too much because I'm being cautious. I want to be clear about what I'm saying, and that does pop into my head. I'm like, I wonder if at that time they felt like they weren't writing anything that was like super crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, because if you look back at the 90s, I mean, even words we said are not said anymore now, and there are things that are probably in all that they say that probably are not said anymore nowadays.
Oh, probably,
like,
yeah.
might be offensive or whatever. So I think times are different. Again, that doesn't excuse anything.
No,
but I think, like, you know, and there are points that bounce back and forth between the documentary that makes Dan not necessarily look like a good or bad guy, but just like, you know, he's very much in the moral gray. Like,
yeah, he seems more. He seems, I guess, humanized.
Yeah,
I think power goes to people's heads. I think the workplace dynamic can be really like.
Yeah,
I'm not saying he did these things out of stress or whatever, but I'm just saying like. I'm never surprised when some dude who has all the power and money and pull in the world does terrible things. That never surprises me.
No,
it bums me out
because it's so easy to do.
Yeah, it's just like I feel like that's what people do.
And he did weird and sketchy things, and I think there's a lot he needs to answer for, or at least, I don't know, do some kind of goodwill to make amends with all the people he affected. But yeah, the angle of the documentary initially, I just didn't feel. I agree. It didn't feel as strong. It felt like they were kind of just throwing a bunch of stuff at you that was like, well, that is bad, but like that was kind of the times, and nobody really thought it was bad until recently.
Right.
And like
another thing about that, because I do think, and again, not again, but another aspect is I don't want to put blame on. There was one journalist in particular, and she would say like, "This scene is this."
Yes.
I don't even want to say what she said because it's like pretty dirty. And I was like, I disagree that that's what that is.
Yes.
I literally think that's a kid's joke.
Yeah.
About someone sneezing on someone else or whatever.
Yeah, it's just like a goofy, goopy goopness.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's exactly what she said in the documentary. See why I didn't want to say it?
Yeah.
But like that, to me, I was like, if you look at it like that, it could be.
Right.
But I think that is a scene where it's like, I wouldn't have thought that because it's in a kid's show.
Yeah.
If they intended it, obviously that's nefarious. But
Right.
I would not have watched that. And I know, and kids aren't watching that thinking that.
Right.
And it made me think of this dynamic where like things have become crazily sexualized. adult content is so easily accessible. It's everywhere.
Yep.
I personally hate that. And I wonder how much our access and exposure to that stuff now actually influences the way people look at stuff like that then.
Like back then, yeah.
Meaning like, yeah, we had the internet and stuff, but this goes from 94. Like
Yeah.
that's when all that premiered. From 94 until what, 2018, I think is when they let Dan Schneider go.
Yeah. Yep.
17, 18. So, I mean, we're talking, that's almost 30 years.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
so much has changed in that time.
Yeah, a lot. So we're looking at that stuff now with the perspective of like cultural influence.
You could probably do that with any movie from the time. Like I watched,
yeah.
you know, I watched Bedazzled recently.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I think that was like 2004 when that came out or something. But yeah, I mean, again, there's a ton of stuff in there that is very sexualized and very like, but it was fine for the time. And it wasn't like a big deal. And I don't think it's, I don't know. It doesn't stand out as weird because my brain is like, this is too sexy now or whatever. Like,
Yeah. Well,
but it feels like a movie that'll never be made now.
yeah, I mean, and there are like different. The key with this one is that it all involves kids.
Yes.
That's the thing that people are, and of course that's a problem. If these things were intended, and I
Yes.
do, it did seem like I said, there were some where I'm like, I don't know how you overlook how weird this is.
Right. And you got to think of all the other people involved because, it's not exclusively Dan that was writing these jokes.
Right.
He had the power to control which ones went through.
Right.
But there were other people, it sounded like a team of writers who were writing these jokes and producers and directors and like
Yeah.
all these people who were just like, we're just making a show here. Like,
Yeah.
So, it's tough because did any of them think it was bad or because it was the 90s, nobody thought it was bad because it wasn't?
Right.
You know, I don't know. I
It's
don't
just
know.
an interesting dynamic there. That one was something. Again, the workplace stuff. Like, I don't know. It to me, I walked away with some discussion points, which I guess is what
Yes.
we're doing right now.
Yep.
The other aspect about that, like you just said, you feel like he needs to like do something to like own up to it. So the interview that he released is so interesting because it feels insanely manufactured,
Oh, it does. That's funny.
but mostly by the interviewer,
Oh.
not by him.
Okay.
But I'm sure it's like
So the guy that was interviewing him played a character on iCarly.
on iCarly.
Yeah.
And he says that at the beginning. He's like, I've been on sets with you, which could be a good credential or a sus one.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
But there's something I'm sure if it's calculated, if it's one, it's probably both. But just the way the dude is interviewing him feels weird. But he does ask all the questions that I would have for him.
Yeah.
He's like, what do you say about this specific woman who said this specific thing? And he does make a lot of apologies and stuff like that in the video. And I'm not saying that is not an excuse for 25 years of an abusive workplace.
No.
But it did make me think like, what do we do with this? Like, I do want to hear him say the things he's saying, but then like, is it up to the public to decide if it's genuine enough? Like, I'm sure it's too little too late.
Oh, yeah.
Because the people in the documentary are talking about this lifelong damage they've experienced from this tough workplace. And I think this is the bigger theme here is like Hollywood and child actors.
Yes.
And if it's happening in kids TV, like let alone on other productions,
Right. Who knows how crazy it gets on like really big budget movies and stuff.
And maybe, maybe it's the reverse. Maybe it's like, of course it happens in kids TV because it's mostly kids, but it's just, that is the bigger thing. That's like, some of the slimiest parts of the documentary are where parents were led to believe everything was okay.
Yes.
And it was totally not.
No. The fact that they had multiple pedophiles on set,
Yeah.
whether or not people knew it, it's just crazy.
Yeah, it's wild. And the actual police reports. And the other thing that made this just a wild documentary is there are moments where they're talking about one pedophile case and literally outing celebrities that were there to support that guy.
Yeah.
I thought that was wild.
It's crazy. I don't know how they got those letters unsealed.
It was like, yeah. I mean, you're getting like exclusives. I'm like, and as they're leading up to it, I'm like, are they about to reveal a bunch of like names?
Yeah.
And they did.
And they did.
Photos and names of like celebrities that were there in the courtroom.
Yep. Well, the courtroom's not confirmed.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Thank you. Watch the documentary. Don't listen to me, guys. That's right. They wrote support letters.
Right. To get a specific person a lesser sentence and probation and stuff like that. But yeah, so the other half of this documentary does focus on Drake Bell, and he is, I would say, probably the most like famous person to be in this documentary. Again, like a lot of people would expect, like
I would say so.
At least as far as like considering all the other Nickelodeon stars that were in the movie.
Yeah, like
or the documentary.
I mean, like we said, there's no like hosts.
Yep. There's no like Josh Peck. There's no.
I was surprised he wasn't in it. Actually,
that's the thing. Everyone is saying that, but he's been kind of like far away from the Drake and Josh thing, and it's tough because I don't really know their dynamic anymore. Everyone just assumes they're like really great friends and stuff. But over the years, I mean, Josh has been pushing away. Didn't invite him to his wedding, and when Drake was going through all these issues, he never said anything. So it's like. But it's tough. I mean, what do you say if you see someone spiraling out of control? Like, you can go try to help.
Sure.
Or, it's tough. It's tough. So,
it is.
But Josh wasn't in it. Obviously, no interviews from Amanda.
No Keenan and Kel.
Yep. No people that people I think would expect to see because they were the stars.
Yeah.
But maybe they just didn't have bad experiences or have anything to say.
That's the thing. The people we heard from did make sense, and there were a lot of moments where I was like, oh, totally forgot about that kid.
Yeah.
And then you find out that makes sense because they were replaced or they were kind of shoved aside or whatever.
Right, because they were whatever situation was going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the stuff with Drake, I mean, we're not going to go into detail about it, but it is, unless you wanted to say anything about it.
No, I like what you're saying now. That takes up a huge, by the time you get to the second episode or the end of the second episode, you're queued up and dialed in.
Yeah.
Like,
I couldn't put it down. Like, even everything we just said about like, some of the threads not being as strong and stuff, watching the whole thing is important because you do get all the rest of the pieces.
Yeah.
And a significantly more intense story and darker story, but equally as important as the main one about Dan, because the second story doesn't even involve Dan at all.
Right.
It's about Drake and his situation.
His only involvement appears to be positive, actually.
Right. Actually, yeah. Like after all that is said and done, like it puts a good light on Dan.
You almost forget the documentary has anything to do with him because you're so pulled into the other story.
Yes.
And it's so intense and unbelievable and heartbreaking. Dude, Drake's dad.
Freaking hero. And your heart breaks watching. Because it is. And yeah, Drake and it just makes you think about all the other child stars. It makes you think about everything that's going on in Hollywood. And we've had numerous scandals over the years of all these crazy things, but it just keeps happening. And it's like, what do we do about it?
I know.
Because this documentary, everybody's talking about it.
Yes.
And so many people, I don't know if it's going to affect Nickelodeon. I don't know if people...
Curious about that.
Yeah, are just more well-informed about it. Is it just going to be a small thing where like a couple people are affected by it? I don't know. But it is... I think it's going to be an important documentary for the future of Hollywood and important for people to watch.
I hope it is. I mean, I hope... Yeah. The two women, the writers who shared about their experience are talking about how like they tried to take action like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's like they had to wait.
Oh, they got a settlement, right?
There was a settlement.
Spoilers.
And,
it's
a quick. It's
I know it's like a quick line. I forgot about
they don't
it.
even. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like it wasn't resolved in the best of ways, I guess, or to a degree.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, she said it impacted her career. And so you hear about things like that, and it's like, all right, that was 20 years ago. I really hope things are a little bit better now.
Yep.
And I think one last thing that I don't know if we're like dwelling on it too long, but I had another thought on it that I thought was interesting because inevitably after something like this, I couldn't stop thinking about it because there's just so much information and so much to consider and think about. And I knew that Drake had those charges regarding him and a minor. So I looked those up, and it just made me curious, or I thought this was interesting. The charges against him were, I only have kind of a loose understanding of it. I just got done watching this documentary about this abuse that he endured. And then, I go online, find everything that you were talking about. DUI, just fleeing, totally being off the grid.
Yep. And he was in stuff for a while. He voiced Spider-Man in the Ultimate Spider-Man show.
Yeah.
He was in a couple movies. Like, he definitely didn't seem like he was not doing well up to a certain
putting out
time.
albums.
Yep.
Like, he did a lot. When he showed the movies he was in, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot. That doesn't even feel like that long ago. I'm sure it was like 12 years ago, but he had I saw a few comments online and stuff that were like, let's not forget about the terrible thing he did to that minor, and people coming at him about that charge. And I saw people come to his defense and say, now this is just based off a couple of comments, but just kind of an analytical point here. I saw people come to his defense and say, nothing physical ever happened. It was some messages, blah, 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 whatever the defense was. And I just find it so interesting because I think by and large, the internet has brought out like the worst of the public.
Yeah.
I think the way people communicate and talk about other people online is largely like with earmuffs so they can't hear anything and with the goal of like a mic drop comment.
Yeah.
That is the whole goal of, I would say, the majority of people online and in comment sections.
Right. Nobody's looking for an argument. They're looking to put their opinion out there and hope that everybody reads it and it's like, they're right.
And
I'm done.
And if they get the most likes,
they won.
Sick. Yep. Done. I won. And then what kills me is if it's on some like historical point or on like if it's about a people group or whatever, I'm like, that comment is going to get lost in like you didn't just solve a problem.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So whatever. Taking that into consideration, people come at celebrities, and I guess anyone, you don't have to be a celebrity, but they come at public legal stories very, very aggressively.
Yes.
So if you hear anything, I think of the Crystalia thing where everybody was like, or a lot of people were like saying he was a pedophile. And I don't think it was anything even remotely close to that.
Nope.
Not here to confirm or deny anything. I don't know, but he still has people that like come after him. He's someone I still watch his videos. I still follow his comedy and everything. And I'll see occasionally a comment that's like, oh, remember when you were a pedophile?
Yep.
And he's talked about it openly on his podcast too. Like being called that is wild. That's a crazy accusation and that will stick. That's the kind of thing that other people will read and be like, oh shoot. So
then they'll look up the story and everything. And
yeah. So the thing with Drake is interesting because being fresh off of this documentary that shows you how just dreadfully victimized this dude has been, it gives people sympathy towards the mistakes that he's made.
Right.
And I just find it interesting that if this documentary didn't exist, I don't think people would even consider being that sympathetic or curious about what his story is.
Yeah.
Because again, what's been done to you doesn't excuse someone who's been hurt can do something terrible to someone else. It's not an excuse.
Right.
But it's just the fact that like it might not excuse something, but it could explain something.
Right. It gives people more understanding, which could ultimately lead to forgiveness or just understanding can lead to a lot of different positive paths.
A little bit of grace.
Yeah.
And again, like grace and forgiveness doesn't mean that person isn't held accountable.
Right.
Because the consequences of their actions can be terrible.
Yeah.
And seeing people say like, oh, well, it wasn't physical, so it wasn't a big deal. I was just thinking
crazy.
like, man, the internet, which again, that is true in considering consequences. Something only being like messages or whatever can be very, very traumatizing and damaging.
And it's shown in the documentary. Like this girl got one message from this guy.
Yes.
And it affected the family.
Not from Drake Bell. This is a different story.
Yeah, a different guy. But yeah, like just a simple message. And sure, there was a picture involved in it, but it could really change the course of someone's life.
Absolutely.
Just being in that kind of situation.
Right. But it is true that you're like, thank God nothing actually happened. You know what I mean? Like that person wasn't physically harmed or whatever. So of course it's terrible. But yeah, I was just thinking about how like if people weren't fresh off this documentary, would the conversation in the comments be like, I don't care if it was physical or not, this dude's trash.
Right.
And I think a lot of it would be.
Yeah. No, I think you're correct because even with the context and everything, the situation still remains the same of what he did.
Right.
And because I think a lot of people want him to be good or innocent or all these things because they like him for the things he was in.
I think that is correct.
And so a ton of people are willing to push that aside now more so than ever.
Right.
Because now they're like, oh, well, this is the reason. And I loved him in Drake and Josh. So whatever he did, I'm going to ignore and just hope he does the best ever.
Right. And I think, and I think that is good. It's not bad to want him to be recovered and you want him to own up to his mistakes and everything. And it's okay to want someone to be good. It doesn't mean they didn't do anything wrong ever. That's not a person who, you know what I mean? Just like a standard mortal human doesn't have zero mistakes.
Right.
But it's interesting to look at in contrast because I've seen the response to Dan Schneider's apology video and people are like, no way, bro.
Yeah, no way.
Send him to jail.
Because he was painted in a bad light in the movie.
Yeah.
Or I say the movie, the documentary.
Yeah.
And rightly so. I mean.
Right. Again, I'm not saying it to excuse him, but it's this interesting thing where it's like, I want him to own up to all his mistakes and I don't know what happens next. I don't, I also, as much an advocate as I am for grace and forgiveness, I also am for justice. I'm not saying that's not there.
Right. But you bring up an excellent point. Like Drake has done things that are comparable to what Dan has done. Well, maybe actually worse. So I don't know. That's tough to decide too.
I don't, if we're comparing,
this is like a morality, like
yeah. Well, that's the thing that gets tricky is like you just have to look at the individual. Like I'm not even necessarily comparing what the two did, but I guess more so the reaction to them.
Right. That people are willing to not forgive Dan as quickly as they are to forgive Drake.
Yeah. And I'm like, what if a documentary came out telling you that Dan was like terribly abused as a child or like whatever.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Would that completely shift the focus of everything?
And it would give some people some explanation, but it doesn't take away the consequences of what he did. Like I'm pretty sure John Wayne Gacy had like the worst childhood ever.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't take away the fact that he murdered tons of children.
No.
Like he was a terrible, terrible person.
Yeah.
But it kind of gives
also
like
a good connection in the documentary.
Oh my gosh, that was
crazy.
Bro, there are moments in this documentary too where I'm like, that person has a sickness. That person is. When I think of like predators,
yes,
I often think like it must be like an impulse. Like it must be like, like what is that?
Yeah,
like that's like a crazy thing.
It's got to be something they can't control or
right. That's how I always think about it. But the calculations described in this documentary. By some people to just get near a certain kid.
Yep.
I'm like, that is super villain level, weird strategy. Like, how's that a real person?
I don't know.
That's crazy.
And the amount of power that person has.
Yes, yes.
Because what trust? Like a very thin veil of trust. Just like, hey, you're going to go take my kid to do all these stuff so I don't have to.
Right, right.
And so, good luck. I don't care what happens after that. And it's just crazy.
Nuts, man. It was, this is why I say I liked it so much, the documentary, not because of the things we just said in concept, but it's just, it's
thought-provoking.
Very thought-provoking.
And you think about all the other elements and the people involved and, it's just so much. There's so much to consider.
And I think it's important stuff. It's not just like talking about it for the sake of talking about it. Some of it maybe.
Even if like you're a fan of Nickelodeon and like all those shows.
Yeah.
Again, the topics that are talked about are way more than just about Nickelodeon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I hope, I don't want anything I said to sound like I'm invalidating or validating anything that should or shouldn't be, but it's just, I don't know, the discussion of like the human condition is so interesting to me. And I feel like the way people talk on the internet, because I think the things we say, whether it's typing or speaking it, has power and it's important.
I think everyone's stupid on the internet.
Everyone's dumb. Everyone's so stupid.
Including us.
Including us. I have things I've typed.
Yeah.
I wish Facebook would stop giving me memories of posts
Dude,
I put up.
every day I log on and I'm like, why did I write this?
Why? And the worst is I can tell you why sometimes.
Yep.
I'll read it and be like, I thought I was so cool.
I thought I was funny.
I posted that so this one person would see it and know that I like whatever, listen to this band or I went and did this thing, you know? And I hate seeing through myself and my past self and be like, why did I do that? And that's just a part of growth of whatever. But the bigger things where it's like someone who really did some terrible stuff or someone who got convicted of something and it's like all they can do is apologize. And then I guess my question is like, is it up to us? Does it matter if we decide their apology is good enough?
Yeah,
or...
who does determine it? Because, like, can he get in trouble for it at this point?
I don't know. He's been talking about having a comeback, I guess, and you know, it's just very interesting. And
but I think the general public, especially if you work in Hollywood and stuff, it definitely does affect everything.
It should, but we learned in the documentary it doesn't for everybody.
Not all the time,
and that is probably the most shocking thing. Some of the resolution of one of the biggest stories in the documentary is so hard to swallow. Parts of it is just so difficult.
It really is because you know, you're like, well, they got all the evidence, they got everything, done deal. See you later, chump. Well, you know, it's crazy because, you know, I think the big thing to point out to all this is the lack of internet at that time.
Yes.
You know, because when said person gets the resolution and it's all complete and the things they go to do after, I think if that happened today, I think they would really struggle to get a job because people would be outing them all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they would be known. Everyone would probably know that, especially because of like this documentary.
Right.
But at the time, you know, it's very easy for producers and writers and all this stuff to hide behind the veil of a bunch of other ones because they're like, all right, you know, because there's no public eye on them.
Right.
You know, nobody's thinking like looking at Sweet Life of Zach and Cody and being like, who's writing here? Like,
yeah, right.
Nobody knows any of that.
100%. Yeah, I think that's very true. The behind the scenes kind of culture that we have now.
Because I couldn't tell you any producers or writers for any show.
I mean,
ever.
Us not even knowing what he looks like, Dan Schneider looks like, and having watched like 5 or 6 of his shows, just goes to show that. And that's part of the it was a different time conversation too, because it's like not that excuses the behavior, but you're not thinking of accountability is very important.
Right.
And if you have none, I mean, that's kind of like the origin of what people call like locker room talk, which I think is, you know, it's fair to say like, yeah, I say some things around these people that I wouldn't around others for, you know, some reasons are okay.
Yeah.
But if it's just like blatant disrespect or like, obviously there's a line is my point.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of stuff that like, oh, if you got caught joking around this way with these friends, you know, you wouldn't say a certain thing in front of your mom that you would in some other friends.
Right, right.
That kind of thing.
Yep.
You know what I mean? But it obviously got taken too far in these rooms because there were no cameras, there were no cell phones, there were nobody's filming and recording every single writing session.
Right.
So whatever they're just like jabbering on about in there just gets taken further and further and further. So I think you're right. I think with the behind the scenes culture we have now, everybody's got to be on their best behavior.
Yep, because they can get caught, which is great. I think that is the other side of the internet. You know, everyone's stupid and has crazy opinions and stuff, but there's also plenty of people who are way more well-informed because the internet can provide answers. Now, are they always accurate? That's you got to figure that out yourself because you can't always read something and trust it. But.
And I think that's maybe the downside is the lack of grace and forgiveness. If someone posts, I could go work with a producer and post online, this person said this thing.
Yep.
And if it's damaging enough, even if it's a lie, it could leave a big enough mark that person's trying to explain themselves or trying to, you know, because of course they're going to deny it.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
especially if it's not true.
But then if people are like, oh, of course he denies it because I wouldn't own up to that racist comment either. You know what I mean? Like, so that's the downside of it. But I think you're right. Like, it just makes you... We say dumb things sometimes, so that accountability forces you to be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, or you know, put my hand on this person this way, or whatever it is. So yeah, the times are definitely. It's interesting to see that dynamic, and that's why it's so interesting that the documentary covers such a huge span of time.
Right.
I can't believe how long we've talked about this documentary.
Because it was.
I can't believe it.
I think it just led to a good conversation. We when we're talking about media and stuff, we just talk about the content of what we watch.
Yeah.
But conversations, I always like having these conversations
too.
on the podcast about stuff. So,
Me too.
But yeah, I think everything you said, Brett, was completely offensive, and you're going to hear from my lawyer at the end of this.
You can afford a lawyer?
6, actually.